afternoon. Cecilia Rouse and Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School. Welcome to today's discussion talk with Robert Zoellick, who served as the 11th president of the World Bank Group. Mr. Zoellick is here as part of the Woodrow Wilson School's Leadership and Governance program, where we bring prominent leaders, especially in public policy, to the school for 2 days. While they're here, they deliver public lectures such as this and also interact with faculty and small groups of students and participate in classroom discussions. So you can see we really put them through their paces. Bob was the president of the World Bank Group from 2007 to 2012. This was not an easy time to be in charge. He had the daunting task of overseeing the World Bank's response to the global financial crisis. During his tenure at the World Bank Group, he is credited for turning around an institution in trouble, working to recapitalize the bank, and expanding financing for developing countries during the food, fuel, and financial crises. He moved to modernize the bank by making it more accountable, flexible, fast-moving, transparent, and focused on good governance and anti-corruption. He increased the representation of developing countries in governance and staffing, and encouraged developing countries to set their own priorities rather than having them dictated from the bank. And Bob's record is marked by an increased role for the private sector through the bank's International Finance Corporation, boosting business, expanding equity investments, mobilizing more co-investments, and recruiting sovereign wealth funds and pension funds to invest in poor countries, especially in Africa. Before his term at the bank, Bob served as Vice Chairman International of the Goldman Sachs Group, as well as Managing Director and Chairman of Goldman Sachs Board of International Advisors from 2006 to 2007. Previously, he had served as Deputy Secretary of State from 2005 to 2006, where he was Chief Operating Officer and led the China policy. He was a member of President George W. Bush's cabinet as U.S. Trade Representative from 2001 to 2005, where he was responsible for America's free trade agenda. From 1985 to 1993, Bob served at the Treasury and State Departments in various posts, as well as White House Deputy Chief of Staff. He was the lead U.S. official in the 2+4 process in German Unification in 1989 to 1990, and served as the President's Sherpa for the preparation of the G7 economic summits in 1991 and 1992. Currently, Bob is the Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a non-resident fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School. He has graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Swarthmore College and earned a JD from Harvard Law School and an MPP from the Kennedy School of Government. As you can see, he's really quite a distinguished leader, and please join me in welcoming Robert Zoellick.
Well, thank you very much, Dean, and I want to thank all of you for the invitation to be with you. Princeton is an extraordinary university, and all of you should be proud to be here and a bit humbled too. For the students, this is a university where the alumni have etched their names in the history of America. I had the good fortune to work for and learn for one of them, James A. Baker III, class of '52, who followed George Shultz, class of 1942, as Secretary of State. Now for the students, each of you, I hope, will have the opportunity to translate that tradition into actions to meet a new generation of challenges. And that is an extraordinary privilege. I also want to thank the faculty and administration of the Woodrow Wilson School. Their research, and testing, and ideas offer all the community a tremendous opportunity to learn from their experience. But it's fine to challenge them too, because that will sharpen your thinking and skills. Indeed, for the students here, you and I actually have a bond because your professor, Robert Cohen, was my first political science professor my very first semester at Swarthmore College. And he was a superb, inspiring, and enthusiastic teacher. However, after one semester teaching me, Professor Cohen decided to leave for Stanford. I'm not sure what conclusion to draw from this, but the record shows that I countered by majoring in history and minoring in economics, not in political science. But I'll share a story about Professor Cohen that might be helpful to you. I recall going to his office to discuss some paper I'd written about international organizations. I think it was the United Nations. and I had read Professor Cohen's work about UN General Assembly voting patterns. So I dutifully discussed the UN's role in shaping policy on some long-forgotten topic. He kindly said one or two things about my paper, but then he asked what I really thought about whether the UN system could be effective on the issue. So the moment of truth had truly come. I was a bit of a skeptic, but he'd done all this research and he'd done all this writing. So I hesitantly offered a not really, and mumbled some reasons why. Then Professor Cohen explained how he had rethought his earlier work and also questioned the UN's effectiveness on the topic. What a relief. I'd learned in my first semester of college that 1, professors could change their minds. 2, they might even question their own research. And 3, I was supposed to think through these topics, applying my own combination of reading and analysis, experience, maybe even common sense. And 4, it was okay to disagree with my professors. Now, I have to admit that those lessons always didn't serve me so well with other teachers. So I had to learn 2 more useful lessons. Pick your shots and use your judgment about when to speak or to argue. So now on to your education. This is a great moment to be studying policy problems. It's a time of challenge around the world. Debt, jobs, hunger and malnutrition, healthcare services and costs, climate, energy security, foreign policy challenges, Iran, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, China, and Asia Pacific and beyond. A changing international economic system with implications for policy, politics, and security. But it's also a time of tremendous opportunity. So take a step back for a minute and consider today's global landscape. Developing countries, many of which were colonies during the last century, are now the engine driving the global economy. Over the past 5 years, they've accounted for around 2/3 of global growth. In 2010 and 2011, China alone consumed over 60% of the world's cement, about half the world's coal, iron ore, lead and steel, about 40% of the world's pigs and eggs, and about 1/3 of the world's soybeans. Now, some of these figures may well decline as China gets built, and China's economy will need to shift to a different structure of growth. But India and others are still to follow. For the decade before the financial crisis, economies in sub-Saharan Africa were growing at about 5% a year. Today, most African countries have already recovered and returned to that rate. So Africa, too, can become a future pole of growth in the world economy. Today, developing countries, even as they remain home to billions of poor people, are looking to one another for ideas. Mexico and Brazil's conditional cash transfer systems are revolutionizing thinking about public assistance through innovative safety net programs. Turkey's economic success is providing an example for reformers in North Africa and the Middle East. India's IT services offer inspirations for Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, and others. Developing countries are increasingly sources of investment. In 2010, investment flows from developing countries reached about $210 billion, and more than half of that went to other developing countries. So here's the point. We're moving to the next age of globalization, an age of multiple poles of growth, an age when emerging markets are increasingly important in all aspects of the global system: trade, commodities, currency and exchange rates, finance, investment, knowledge, development, the environment, and security too. It's a tectonic shift in the global landscape, and it's happened roughly over the past 10 years, a microsecond in historical terms. Global businesses and investors are aware of these changes, and they're racing to catch up. I think policymakers are still a bit behind. The third world is an outdated concept. With the end of the Cold War and the demise of the Second World, at a minimum, developing countries should have moved up a place. But the real point is that developing countries are not just subsidiary category. They're not just dependencies or charity cases. They're diverse. They are growing economically and in influence, and they want to be the stewards of their own futures. They want more of a voice in the global system, and the world needs them over time to assume more responsibilities within that system. So this is an incredibly exciting time to be entering the public policy world, a time of flux and a time when ideas and action can shape the future. Increasingly, policymakers will have to break free of some of the old constraints to connect the private sector to public policies. When I was at the World Bank, I encountered a new pragmatism all across the developing world about the role of the private sector in areas that used to be dominated by public monopolies. Infrastructure, education, healthcare, skills training, delivery of public services, and advanced economies should be taking note too. Diplomacy needs to change as well. We need to develop effective ways to get the assistance of the private sector in shaping international public policy. The world that you're entering needs your know-how, the analytical and practical skills to actualize solutions to the world's problems. Now, I graduated from Harvard's joint JD and Master of Public Policy program in 1981. And from that time to this, I've seen public policy programs emphasize important training in quantitative skills. Many of the students here probably are or will be well-versed in data analysis, game theory, decision matrices, and linear regression models. And that training offers an excellent foundation. But what's really exciting about making public policy isn't evaluating and analyzing and predicting. It's delivering results. And if you really want to deliver results outside the classroom, quantitative analysis needs to be complemented by qualitative analysis, the political, bureaucratic, behavioral, social, cultural, and ethical skills. So today I'd like to share 5 lessons that may be of use to you as qualitative analysts and actors. First, history is important. Earlier this year, I attended a program at the John F. Kennedy School for, it was a faculty seminar, and Henry Kissinger had visited recently. And he made an observation about government that the faculty still found revealing. The 2 most useful disciplines for government service, Kissinger said, are history and philosophy. Now, neither is taught at the Kennedy School. Now, fortunately, one of the reasons that I went to Harvard was to discuss the teaching of applied history. History offers perspectives on problems. 2 other Harvard professors, Richard Neustadt and Ernest May, called it thinking in time. The idea that when we consider current challenges, we can draw on history to assess today's issues within the stream of events. Now, history doesn't offer a cookbook of policy recipes. In fact, May and Neustadt warn that the use of historical analogies is fraught with pitfalls. And they observed that human experience also includes discontinuity, sudden, sharp, and hard to foresee, if foreseeable at all. Yet the founding fathers of the United States, including your fellow Princetonian Madison, led one of the great discontinuous events of all time. And the founding fathers drew on history actively. They looked to Plutarch's Lives for studies of character. They studied the classical age for insights on republics and liberties. They designed a document, an unusual written constitution, drawing on the experience of modern European history. A few of them wrote the Federalist Papers, a fascinating compendium of implied history, analysis, and advocacy to explain this new constitution. Thinking in time suggests questions to ask before one rushes to produce that very favorite of policymakers, the options paper. What's the history of a case? How have other people tried to solve this or similar problems? What worked? What didn't? What institutions have been involved, and what's their history? What people are involved? What's their history? Rather than asking, what's the problem, policymakers would often be better to say, tell me the story. How can we understand ethnic conflict from Kosovo to South Sudan if we don't know the story behind the fighting, often going back hundreds of years? How can we understand the challenges of the Eurozone today if we do not know the story of Germany and Europe and the logic of integration that Europe's leaders have established as a testament of faiths? How can we understand China's world of the view today if and China's place in it if we do not know how China tells its own story of humiliation and revival in the modern era. Thucydides, an exiled former maker of public policy, discussed the value of history this way: those who want to understand clearly the events which happened in the past and which, human nature being what it is, will at some time or another, in much the same way, be repeated in the future. Now, when I served at the State Department in the administration of President George H.W. Bush, I pressed the U.S. Trade Representative's office, which I later had the good fortune to lead, to pursue the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. At the time, USTR's tradition and its organizational culture was to be very wary of bilateral and regional accords. USTR was reflecting the conventional wisdom, which since has been challenged by research as well as practical experience, that free trade agreements would undermine global trade liberalization. For me, however, NAFTA, in addition to being good economic and trade policy, offered a historical opportunity to start to unite North America, and in the process, overcome suspicions with a neighbor that had lost half its territory to the United States over a century earlier in the Mexican-American War. Moreover, I sensed that the old corporatist one-party state of Mexico was on the precipice of change, and I hoped that Mexico's modernization as an economy, as a democracy, as a civil society, could be connected to the US and to the Canadian experience. So NAFTA offered a huge step in the direction of that strategic opportunity. In many respects, all three countries are just beginning to capitalize on those possibilities through economic integration, energy, the environment, education, movement of people, foreign policy, security, and then cooperation across the hemisphere and the world. Now, fortunately, I could draw on another historical insight to help overcome USTR's reluctance to pursue NAFTA. It turned out that the US President, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Commerce were all Texans. Although 19th century Texans had fought for independence from Mexico, the late 20th century Texans' view was one of affinity with Mexico. So while history is informative, it's certainly not determinative. That great student of humankind, Mark Twain, said it this way: history may not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. Second, look at the whole elephant. There's a well-known fable about several blind people who are asked to describe an elephant. One feels the leg and says an elephant is like a pillar. Another holds on to its trunk and says an elephant is like a big snake. Their descriptions are accurate, but they're limited. To solve problems, one needs to consider multiple dimensions. When I consider a problem now, it's instinctive for me to think about the institutions involved, the authorizing environment, possible coalitions, likely opposition, implementation, legal issues, resource dimensions, communications, and how the problem fits into a stream of other issues. The whole elephant. Because if you only look at the foot, you're likely to miss the toothache that prompts the kick. So let me offer an example. At the end of 2007, food prices surged around the world, and the stress was exacerbated by soaring fuel prices. Some of the economists at the World Bank said that returns from high commodity prices would allow most countries to offset the danger. Others suggested that the problem would be best handled by humanitarian agencies, not a long-term development institution. They were looking at the problem from a wide angle and long-term lens. They were missing what was right in front of our eyes. Tens of millions of poor people with no cushion to soften the blow. Families going without meals. Farmers who couldn't get inputs they needed. Food riots breaking out. We had to disaggregate producers and consumers within countries. We needed to get people through the short term to get them to the long term. And we also needed to see, even as we were meeting immediate needs, how we could increase food production and productivity in poorer countries so people could increase their earning power. So the World Bank reached out to civil society groups to help build support, gain information, and assist partners in the field. Through these networks, we connected the agricultural, humanitarian food, and nutrition communities, which often go their separate ways. New international actors, such as the Gates Foundation, became critical partners. To avoid unhelpful squabbling, the World Bank suggested and helped make effective a UN task force that integrated the policy and practical work of a variety of UN and international bodies. So you see that early lesson from Professor Cohen about making the UN more effective had consequences. The World Bank created a rapid financing facility to support basic inputs for farmers, especially small ones. The bank's standard funding was somewhat constricted, so we created a trust fund to mobilize other resources. To help countries boost productivity and production, the World Bank Group's public and private sector arms worked across the agricultural value chain: research, property rights, seeds, irrigation, fertilizers, storage, marketing, as well as fostering private sector development. The World Bank put its financial expertise to work to help countries manage the risk of future crises through weather derivatives, crop insurance, access to futures markets. This was a big elephant. To try to steer it, we had to see all of the beast. Third, don't just analyze a problem, solve it. At all the places that I've worked, I've been able to learn from colleagues who are extremely skilled. They've studied the data, they know the research, sometimes they've even written the book. But textbook answers are not enough. One also has to understand the political economy context. I told my colleagues at the World Bank that if the best textbook solution didn't work for our client, we hadn't solved the problem. Bring the perspective of a problem solver, not just an analyst. It's also a good lesson for your relationship with your bosses. George Marshall told his colleagues, "I don't want you fellows sitting around asking me what to do. I want you to tell me what to do." As the U.S. Trade Representative, I supervised and participated in many negotiations. And the key to our completion of so many free trade agreements was that we had a team that knew that the objective was to consult, yes, analyze, yes, work with Congress, yes, but most of all, to close the deal, decide. If you put yourself in the shoes of a decision maker and ask yourself, what would help that person, whether through preparation, decision, or follow-through, or ask yourself, what would you decide? You're more likely one day to become the decision maker yourself. Now, ownership is also important in solving problems. Solutions are not just disconnected answers to problem sets. Ownership leads to legitimacy and effectiveness. One of Afghanistan's most successful development projects is the National Solidarity Program, NSP, which the World Bank launched in 2003 and we discussed in one of the classes today. The NSP created more than 20,000 elected community development councils and empowered them with very modest grants, whether to invest in micro hydro generators, schools, roads, irrigation, erosion, or water supply systems. I met with a women's council in an Afghan village and saw that they brought information and insights and add-ons to the projects that we had funded, but they had decided. Equally important, the women felt they could accomplish things. They discussed other problems. They supported one another. They started small businesses together, and they became customers. So far, the NSP has reached more than 17 million Afghans in 34 provinces and has an economic rate of return of close to 20%. When the Taliban have attacked projects, villagers defend them. And the government of Afghanistan is now considering how to use these local development councils to help with the delivery of other public services. Fourth, don't forget the public in public policy. After all, the policies that we work on belong to the public. Just as you were studying at a time of enormous change, I was fortunate to be faced with a huge transformation early in my career. In 1989, I worked for Secretary of State James Baker as the Cold War was coming to an end. And I was able to serve as the lead official in the 2+4 negotiations for Germany's unification. Now, U.S. policy toward German unification was based in part on a careful reading of the mood of the German public, East and West. Our diplomats in East Berlin had concluded that East Germans wanted a so-called third way, die dritte Weg, between capitalism and communism, but a few of us sensed that they were wrong. We realized that most East Germans wanted what their West German cousins had already enjoyed, Now, this insight meant that West Germany was the one legitimate state in the eyes of most Germans. Unification would be a takeover by West Germany, not a merger. And we also saw that the human momentum behind unification posed risks if the diplomatic process stalled. Speed could be an asset. The public momentum that drove unification kept its opponents off balance. Yet public opinion was not only a matter for Germans. To agree to Germany's unification within NATO, President Gorbachev had to come up with an explanation that he could use at home, and it was in the US interest to help him do so. Executive branch officials, often backed by experts in studies, can get frustrated by legislators and their processes. But legislators are representatives of the public. One needs to listen to what these representatives say and what they don't say. The most effective executive branch officials try to help legislators develop explanations for the votes that they're going to be asked to take. Now, the World Bank is trying to make openness to the public an asset and a tool. The World Bank instituted a far-reaching access to information model on the US and Indian Freedom of Information Acts. And in 2010, the World Bank launched an Open Data, Open Knowledge, Open Solutions initiative. All the World Bank Group's data, project information, and knowledge is now online in real time for free. The bank has mapped all our projects so that anyone with an internet connection can now download the bank's data, you can analyze it, and come up with your own development solution. And the next step for the bank is to try to make this information interactive. My aim at the time was to democratize development so that a network of publics could see what the bank is doing, add their information, and contribute to development solutions. Fifth, build in feedback loops. I often encourage my colleagues to anticipate, to try to think ahead to prepare for uncertainties. Dwight Eisenhower pointed out that plans were worthless, but planning is everything. As von Moltke, the German military strategist, explained, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. So it is with most policy planning. The planning process leads one to consider all dimensions of a problem and how they interrelate. Successful public executives start with planning, but then need to continually seek intelligence, assess implementation, make adjustments, all while avoiding a loss of momentum or even paralysis. The information is never perfect. The OODA loop is a concept that was first developed by a US Air Force colonel and strategist. The OODA stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. And the idea is to tighten that loop as much as possible so one continually reorients and acts more quickly. The concept was originally applied to combat operations, but I found that it's very useful in many situations. An OODA loop is just a way to think about ongoing learning. Part of learning is being honest with yourself and others. Now, the World Bank draws wonderful, committed, and intelligent people. But the bank has to safeguard against a special risk. Most bank staff have been high performers, like the people in this room. Admitting failure is not a natural thing. They're also deeply committed to helping those most in need. So when the staff has worked long and hard on a project to try to deal with a tough issue of poverty, it's hard to admit when things go wrong. It's just human nature to say, well, it could have worked, it should have worked, I wish it worked, it would have worked. And I tried to get my colleagues to acknowledge when it didn't work. Now, of course, everybody prefers success. But if poverty were so easy to overcome, somebody would have done it long ago. All of us make mistakes. The key is to acknowledge them, learn, and move on. The real sin is ignoring mistakes, or worse, seeking to hide them. I've always considered public service to be the highest calling. So I'm pleased for the students and all of you involved that you're pursuing and supporting careers in public policy. You will have the opportunity to make history. You were probably drawn to this school because you wanted to serve. And that involves a great responsibility of public trust. So respect the public you serve, even when you disagree. The same is true about those with whom you negotiate in a government or in our government of separated and shared powers or with other governments. It helps to reach solutions if you try to understand the other person's position, even if you disagree with it. Ambassador Bob Strauss, a shrewd and masterful former head of the Democratic National Committee, U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador to Russia, gave me 2 excellent pieces of advice when I visited him after I was nominated as U.S. Trade Representative. First, Strauss said, when it comes time to trade something, trade it as many times as you can. With more than one country, members of Congress, interest groups, wring that concession dry. Second, Strauss reminded me, there are SOBs in both parties. Find the people who want to deliver results and work with them across parties. Now, advocacy is vital, and so is fighting for ideas and resisting opponents. But a lot of public policy is about the art of the possible. Compromise is not necessarily a dirty word. So ultimately, I hope you have a passion for delivering results. That's the real challenge, beyond what you've read in books or written in papers or the numbers crunched or the theories devised and tested. Because in the end, it's about putting those technical skills to work to get things done. Now, many public officials seem content to hold posts, be part of the flow of events, analyze and comment, attend the meeting. Be a doer. Keep your eye on achieving results, on accomplishing things. That's what's exciting about your future careers. You can make a difference, and all best wishes as you do so.
Mr. Zoellick is available for questions. I'd like to say a couple things. One is we'd like to encourage students to come first to the microphones, and he's requested that anybody who has a question first, please introduce yourself. Perfect.
We call that a false positive.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Liz Ramey. I'm a second-year master's student here at the Woodrow Wilson School. You spoke a lot about the need for taking an interdisciplinary perspective on things, looking at the history and the politics of a problem. So I'm curious to what extent or what steps you think the World Bank has taken as an institution that's primarily of economists to promote those different perspectives in its own work, and what steps you think might be taken in the future to encourage a broader range of perspectives on the World Bank's endeavors.
It's an interesting question, particularly with your focus on economists, because if you go back and look at the history of the bank, actually in early years, it was primarily engineers, specialists in various fields. And when I came to the bank, I know this will be a shock, some of my friends in the economics community said, it's drifted too far from economics. You need to emphasize the economics one. But the bank actually brings in people with pretty diverse backgrounds and specialists in different fields or their topical fields. But the way that I would approach your larger point is that one of the challenges for the bank, and it's inherent in my comments, is that while as an economic and multilateral institution it's supposed to be non-political, you have to understand the political and context in which you work. And the work at Princeton and others about governance and development emphasize this more and more. So the real challenge is, as a leader in an institution, how can you bring those topics into an accepted part of the discussion and debate while recognizing you have 188 shareholders from very different political systems? And so, part of this again is, as I mentioned, sort of picking your shots, but also what I found is quite encouraging, and it's a sense a derivative of this development process. We have now some incredible learning experiences, even over the past 10 years, from a variety of developing countries. So I urge a pragmatic approach. So even in countries that are non-democratic systems, I found people willing to discuss governance, rule of law, the importance of openness and transparency, the roles of the private sector in aspects. Now, you can only go so far if a country's, one of the points I've also trying to make is that you can bring the best minds, the money, skills, but if people aren't going to do it and not going to own it, it's not likely to happen in its event. But what we're increasingly seeing is, most leaders want their countries to grow. They are looking around. So, I mean, and look at the examples of, Myanmar or Burma and the effect of the ASEAN countries and sort of seeing these changes. You see this all throughout Africa. And one of the encouraging parts is that I've found is that countries really respond quite well to this point about moving beyond dependency, moving beyond being wards of the system. They want to have authority for their own future. For the staff at the bank, this is, to be fair to them, this is a bit of a challenge because you're asking them to move out of a comfort zone of economic analysis and study the institutions and others. So first is, for some of them, you need to bring those skills. They may need to train them, you may need to bring people in. But the second tricky issue is that how do they avoid growing across a line where they get involved with the politics of a country? And there, what part of the responsibility is to create the supervision, the support networks, the people that you can call on to try to deal with these sort of issues. I talked actually about conflict state, very nature of security, economic. And so in that context, I actually tried to create a hub, and I gather that Joel Hellman actually was here not too long ago, was the head of the hub. To not only have sort of an expert team that we could deploy with our country teams, but also as a sort of a place of learning sort of and experience with us. So what I've also found at the bank, and this is how you have to be an adaptable institution, is as your client needs change, you obviously have to look to bring in different people and specialists. Now the challenge, one of the aspects about the bank is that people often says, oh, it does too much. And so I often would ask, well, what would you like us to drop? If you actually look at the history of dropping things, it dropped infrastructure because the private sector was going to do that, and it dropped agriculture for some reason I still don't understand. And actually, if you think about some of the big issues of development now, they focus on those areas. Now, at the same time, as I've tried to approach infrastructure, I'm trying to figure out a way, when I was at the bank, to draw private capital into it. So I created another hub in Singapore to do this. So part of this is starts out with your client. I was always trying to focus that the bank is not there as an elitist that's sort of come down and saying, thou shalt do this or this. Try to understand the client, try to help the client. And then as an executive, I and the team that you built, they're there to try to support and help. And frankly, going back to this feedback loop, I tried to watch these situations quite closely. So I could give you lots of examples with the Arab Spring or Arab turmoil or whatever we want to call it, is that I had a very close iterative process with the people there to help them, guide them through these issues. So as in a lot of these questions, there's no formula, but as an executive, you can partly create incentives, be alert, anticipate, support people. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Cece. I'm also a first-year student at the Woodrow Wilson School. You talked about how the world is becoming increasingly multipolar. And I was interested in what you think the World Bank role is in encouraging development of more regional banks and sort of, what the stance of the World Bank is in terms of should regional banks gain more power relative to the World Bank, or what sort of balance of power and influence could result from that relationship.
Okay. First, a minor clarification, but there's a point behind it. I said a multipolar world economy. Okay, that's different than a multipolar world. Okay? And it's probably something that Bob Cohen's very familiar. There have been lots of discussions about multipolarity, and what I'm trying to emphasize is on the economic side that hasn't yet been translated into security or some other topics. But we'll leave that for another day. on the regional development banks. This came up at a lunch question we had, very interesting. The banks have different histories. They were developed at various times. My view of the role of the World Bank with the regional banks was that we should see them as partners in a network. I had the good fortune of knowing a lot of the heads of those banks from my prior work, and many of them were friends, and so I tried to play a convening role where we could try to work together cooperatively on problems, but in some ways, you also have to figure out who takes the lead in some circumstance. Now, one big issue, though, that I don't want to lose sight of is that regional banks have the benefit of familiarity with the region. They have the disadvantage of they're not global. And if you listen to what I was just referring to, what's intriguing about development is the conditional cash transfer programs from Mexico being applicable in North Africa. That's where the World Bank has an additional role, and frankly, the analytical and other capabilities add to that. But one of the examples would be that when I wanted to make more of a focus on corruption, and we have a sanctions policies that will debar companies from work if they've violated our rules, we actually worked across institutions, so we had a multiple debarment. You cheat one of us, you get thrown out with all of us. It would seem logical, but it has to, somebody has to put that work together. A different example, again, I mentioned at lunch, was that when the financial crisis hit Europe, I was very concerned about Central and Eastern Europe, because with my own familiarity with Europe, I figured that the main institutions of the European Union would focus on the Western European countries. And yet you have a structural situation where a lot of the banks in Central and Eastern Europe are owned by Austrian, Italian, French banks. And there was the risk that as they pulled back, you could have a big credit contraction. Now, this was an interesting example of a political economy approach. The then head of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, extraordinarily capable individual named Thomas Miro, very much agreed with me. But frankly, the EC wasn't focused so much on this issue. So I worked with Thomas to kind of put the EBRD in lead, so it had a European face. But then I was a bit of a club. I went to Brussels and gave an interview with the FT and others to try to emphasize this and kind of bring along the other sort of parties, European Investment Bank, IMF, into the system. So that was a good example of where you're trying to support one another. When it came, in another very practical example, in the course of this crisis, the multilateral development institutions can build capital through their revenues, particularly on the private sector side, or they can plow them back into assistance for the poorest, but you can't raise capital in private markets. And we needed to expand our role because we did a lot of lending. So when it came time to actually do recapitalization and bring it through the US Congress, the World Bank, by dint of the US's association with it, partly my relations and others, actually became the locomotive that pulled through their capital increases too. So there's lots of examples of this, but it's one of the points that I always had to also deal with my staff. It's not surprising, there's a little competition or rivalry, and now and then a regional development bank might be sort of claiming or taking a lead in an area where my staff thought was a little bit, but you know, it's a little bit like the United States and the international system. You can live with that if it moves the system overall. So, you know, that's okay. Let them, you know, and by and large, in fact, all of them were extraordinarily good colleagues, and we tried to work and support each other. It's another example, when it goes time to things like G20 or G7 meetings, the heads of the World Bank and the IMF are at these meetings. Sometimes the head of the WTO, the regional banks aren't there. So I would regularly meet with the heads of those banks, and we would talk in advance about these sessions. And then another example was when it came time to create a series of climate investment funds where we got contributions of about $7 billion that we leveraged into about $50 billion. We did this also with the regional banks. So but just to close, so I don't go on too long with examples on this, is that what you're raising, however, is an example of a bigger issue, which is how the bank works with UN agencies, how the bank works with foundations, how the bank works with bilateral development programs, how the bank works with the private sector. So part of our job, you know, when I was at the bank is, you know, we're not a small institution, but relative to capital markets and the challenge, we're a drop in the bucket. So how could you leverage? So as an example, when trade finance dried up in the crisis, through IFC, our private sector arm, we created a system working with a series of commercial banks to draw them back into the market. And so we were using their money, but we're using our money to leverage this. When I created this, I reached out to sovereign wealth funds and in the sense of created a series of equity funds to invest in sub-Saharan Africa and others, and opening the door for, I hope over time, other equity funds to move into these areas. And we actually supported some private equity funds. So if you think about the changing world economy, it's so different from 1945 or 50, where you had a limited number of institutions and control points. And to be effective, we had to be nimble and flexible, working a multiplicity of networks. You're next.
Hi, Ben Horowitz, MPA 1. You spoke at the beginning of your talk about the need to expand our ideas about results beyond the context of just simple data analyses. And I think bringing a qualitative measure alongside the harder data. I'm wondering if there's a tension there with the move towards looking at scalability and sort of evidence-based best practice, and if in resolving that tension, you come up with problems with perception of bias and how you end up making your decisions.
Yeah, I actually gave a speech on this. It was interesting. It was the first speech of a World Bank president in 60 years about the field of development economics and research, and I was partly, it was a hobby horse of mine. I was partly challenging the profession that I felt had two potential weaknesses, and you've got Angus Deaton here, so you've got somebody of a great quality who understands these issues and actually help with some of these topics. I was sometimes worried that the envy that the economics profession and later the political science profession had towards science led them to move towards mathematical modeling. And sometimes the models became ends in of themselves. And so the brightest students were those who could manipulate the models and test to come up with new tools, but it started to move further and further away from what I face as a policymaker in a multilateral or other institutions. So number one, I was partly trying to challenge people to say, try to think about how this can be relevant to policymakers, and this brings in the institution and other aspects. But there was a second point in particular, and these things go in waves in a pendulum. If you look at the study of development economics, there were phases where there were sort of grand models and concepts that people would come up with, and most of them turned off to be interesting but wrong in some dimension. Okay? This actually led the development profession into another track, which is kind of associated with the MIT lab, and which is basically the controlled experiment. So we can't trust anything unless we do controlled experiments. There's, you know, as in anything in life, there's some interesting things from it, okay? But what was frustrating to me, and again, you see, I look at problems as the guy who's got 40 things hitting me at the desk trying to direct and guide others and talk to finance ministers or prime ministers to solve problems, is that often I'd look at this research and they'd say, but by the way, if you change this variable, if we do this, then you can't rely on it, so on and so forth. Well, okay, but you know, real people have to draw conclusions and make decisions. And so what I was trying to also encourage the profession was, fine, do that work, that's all well and good, it can add, given good insights, and I always like the kind of, as I was suggesting, feedback loops, evidence. But on the other hand, help us try to solve the problems that the finance ministers bring to me or the prime ministers bring to me. And you know, so in the case of a fragile state, the combination of the security, the governance, the development, how to make those sort of fit together. So, you know, it's always fun to throw a little bomb and start a little debate on some of these topics. It actually didn't go too far because as a non-credentialed economist, I could only, you know, challenge it to a degree. But my larger point is not really to say ignore that work and not to say, you know, lose the evidence based. As you properly said, I'm focusing on sort of results and information flow. But I've also am trying to broaden it. So if you'll see, the open information system is partly trying to say, not only have our people check things, not only have fine scholars in the United States check things, let's open it. And what's increasingly possible around the world is have many others come in and bring their analyses and things. But then the last point I'll say, and this goes a little bit to my comment about the micro points, is that, you see, the worst thing is to get paralyzed. is you spend all your time being confused on something and this, then the other thing. And, you know, real people in those jobs have to decide. And as you could see, part of my theme is, you know, you're never going to have, one of the things I learned in public policy school is there's a cost of perfect information. And I've never had it in almost any job I've been in. So that I have to figure out when to get more, you know, when to do pilots, when to do different things. So that's what I've been trying to encourage, I guess.
Hi, my name is Phil Ham. I'm a PhD student in the Woodrow Wilson School.
And you're doing quantitative analysis on matrices, no?
Not quite, actually, partially studied the World Bank. The World Bank has changed significantly as an institution, adopting environmental impact assessment requirements, community consultation requirements, and independent assessment panel. I'm interested in the continued influence of the World Bank in international development, particularly thinking about the growing influence of South-South actors. I'm wondering if you can talk about the role, or the potential role of the World Bank in influencing standards for development across institutions.
Yeah, good talk. Well, first off, I'm glad you recognize the bank has done some of those things. And actually, in the environmental area, it shows how these change. When I was at the Treasury in the 80s, we had to press the bank to start to take account of environmental issues. The danger, this is a part of your question, the danger, however, is sometimes we're subject to so many constituencies that want to have so many checks and balances and so many reviews that we can take ourselves out of the game. We add to the costs and we make it hard to deal with, or we add to the time. So part of the challenge as an executive or the people is how do we maintain those high standards? How do we maintain the high values, but not in a way that either paralyzes us or adds unreasonable costs? Now, you then connected it to the South-South point. And I guess what I find is most people want to do the right thing. They just need some help. So part of it is sharing that information, sharing the experience from other developing countries. You know, take China today. China has learned that there's a huge cost to the the development process that ignored the environment. And the bank still does work with China, but about 80% of it is environmentally related. And so, frankly, we can point to the Chinese experience with others to say there are things you could do from the start that will minimize your costs over time. Now, if somebody's in a rush, they may ignore it, and that's an issue where we may or may not be able to help them, we may or may not be involved, so we can't control that. But what I'm suggesting is in the development process, or whether it's trade negotiations or much reform policy, the most effective way is to try to identify mutual interests, try to identify what people can draw from. And what's neat is that it was probably a little harder when you're going to Sierra Leone and you're explaining what happened in the United States and Europe. It seems sort of far away, okay? But if you're going to Sierra Leone and you can say, look, this is what happened in Timor-Leste, or this is what we did in Liberia, it's a little bit real to review. So this is, again, the information networks and the sharing to try to build those. Now, there's another dimension to this issue, and that is as you get more South-South investment, big question related to China, for example, Chinese resource investment in sub-Saharan Africa. You know, what do you do to try to encourage better performance? Well, step one, don't be a hypocrite. In other words, if you go and say to the Africans, you shouldn't take Chinese investment, you know, we in America and Europe know this is bad for you, the Africans are going to say, well, who the heck are you to tell us this, okay? But they're worried too. And so what you need to do is approach both sides of the equation, the Chinese side and the African side, and try to say, look, sometimes it's building competency, sometimes it's building the capacity, sometimes it's the transparency, sometimes it's doing a project with them in some ways that you can sort of build this. And then similarly on the Chinese side, you're going to get different voices. Some of them don't want to become the new imperialists. They know this will backfire. You had some problems in Zambia as one country that came to mind with copper mining and others. On the other hand, you're going to have some Chinese businesses go in, and they're going to want to basically meet their target quickly with the lowest possible costs. And so how can you work those to try to encourage a better level of performance and a longer-term investment? And so, for example, trying to talk to the Chinese about how they might help train some of the skills of the African labor so they're not just bringing in Chinese labor. There's a host of things that one could do in this. Now, is it perfect? No, but you know, part of economics and much of my life is incrementalism.
Hello, my name is Julio Herrera. I'm a first-year PhD student in civil and environmental engineering.
Where are you from?
Mexico. I have two questions. One is, unfortunately, corruption is present in many governments around the world, but it seems that it's more present in developing countries. So, first of all, how do you work with governments that are very, very corrupt? And my second question is, you speak about the importance of recognizing our mistakes. So I was just wondering what you would say were some of the recent mistakes by the World Bank and what the World Bank has learned in terms of development practices. Okay.
Well, on the first one, this obviously varies enormously, and sometimes you've got people in the government. We were talking about this with some of the fellow students about sometimes people in the government want to do the right thing, but they got opponents on the other side. How can you strengthen them? Part of it again goes back to sharing the experience. Most officials realize if they want to have history or legacy that being associated with large sums of stolen money, failed projects is not the greatest way to go down in history. So part of it is, can you show them how to try to improve this? Now you mentioned Mexico. This is an interesting possibility. One of the challenges now in many developing countries that have democratized is they're decentralizing power. This happened in Indonesia, it's happened in Mexico, it happens with the Brazilian states as well. This is actually an area of opportunity for the bank, because one of the ironies is often at the federal level, those governments are actually getting pretty competent and often clean. But at the state level, sometimes it's not so good. And so as they decentralize for political reasons, there's often a capacity issue. The bank in some of those countries was increasingly shifting its work to the state level with the idea that, and we've done a lot of this in Brazil, and I launched a whole new effort in the Northeast where out of the poor states, we organized the governors. And just to show you the power of this, we have Bauer limits, and Brazil was approaching it. The governor of Pernambuco organized 7 of the northeastern states to say, we want World Bank loans so badly, not just really for the money, but kind of the training, the knowledge, to go to capacity building with it, that they pressed the Ministry of Finance to prepay $3.5 billion of loans so we could relent $3.5 billion. So it shows you what the loans are really about. But it also tells you something. Ministries of Finance are normally powerful. For these governors to do this kind of shows some shift in this. And the reason I mentioned it in Mexico is that when I met with your President-elect Pinochet earlier on, one of the things I was trying to suggest as I had his predecessor is, you know, some of the bank efforts might be done at some of the state level with some of the Mexican states where, again, there's sort of a capacity level. More broadly on the issue of corruption, I think there's different levels. One, as the head of an institution, I had a fiduciary responsibility. So I had to watch not to allow a dollar to be stolen. And we had to develop systems and procurement and so on and so forth to try to do that. Secondly, this goes to a little bit to some of the political and governance issues. There's a certain amount you can control yourself. But if you can start to make more transparent, open systems, engage civil society, get social accountability, and I tried to launch some things to do this, you actually get a whole new set of allies, a whole bunch of people in the community who don't want to be ripped off, and it can actually affect the process. Okay, so that's another strength in the system. And then sometimes you have to say no. And this is actually sometimes you asked about some of the mistakes in the bank. Sometimes it's hard for the bank to say no. But even this is not always such an easy question, because you might have a problem with a government at a certain level, but you might have a human needs project dealing with malaria or HIV/AIDS or something like that. And so when do you withdraw? How do you withdraw? How do you signal it? Much of life is putting together coalitions. Can you bring leverage and other parties in this process? And by the way, let's look at, again, both sides of the equation. I launched something called the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative. So how can we work with some of the developed countries and their banks that were the homes for these stolen assets to try to recover some of them? And we had some success, and there's international agreements that are going on that. And also, remember, the bribers also have to be gone after. So we did this obviously in a way where we're not trying to target people, but if we found major corporations that were stealing, well, we hit them hard, and we tried to come up with a variety of different ways to deal with this, with sanctions and other process, and if we linked them to the other regional development banks, they had more effort. So there's no, as in many of these cases, you have tools, you still have to use judgment. And depending on the country, you can share lessons and transparency and others. And we talked about actually with some of your classmates some cases where I actually said we had to pull out on a given basis. But I don't do that lightly.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Congratulations on your inauguration.
Hello, my name is Arman. I'm a junior also at the Civil Engineering Department. I'm also doing architecture and urban studies, and thank you very much for coming here. And I guess I should thank you for making the World Bank really transparent as it is now.
Oh, thank you.
It's like a huge collection of information.
I hope you find it useful. I always find it encouraging when people use the information.
Yeah, one of my favorite things on the website is that map that shows the projects all over the world. There are like lots of projects in lots of places. And I was wondering, so you also mentioned you're trying to understand the client rather than saying do this, do that, like a bunch of technocrats that come in and say do this, do that. But like, my question is, how do you do that? How do you understand the client? What are the ways to do that? I guess you answered it a little bit in the other question. But like, also, how do you prioritize the projects that you undertake?
Well, I'll take the priorities one. This has to be an iterative process. So what we try to do is you start out with your clients. You try to understand what problems your clients see. But you also bring global knowledge. So let me give you a very practical example. in the midst of this financial crisis, we had to ramp up lending, different types of support, so on and so forth. But my own view is this was going to be going on for a while, and we had to prepare for different dimensions. I believe, and I have some concern, we're going to live in a volatile environment. Some people believe, let's control commodity prices. I don't think that's going to work. But what I do think makes sense is to try to have safety nets that are effective and efficient for the most vulnerable. And so building on the Mexican Oportunidades program, as I mentioned here in Brazil, the bank helped 40 different countries in the world develop this. But some countries don't have that capacity. And so some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, it might be based off a school feeding program. It might be based on other types of community programs to make sure those at the bottom get some cushion and protection. And the reason I cite the Oportunidades program is there's some things to learn for advanced economies here too. This is done for about 0.5% of GDP, which is pretty darn efficient. So part of this would be institutionally, the way I did this as an executive is I had my staff actually assess every country in the world and try to understand the nature of the safety net programs, and then try to start a discussion with those countries. We have country managers, country teams all around the world to sort of talk about, the need, the risk, what can be done. Here's different ways you can design it. People have different, Ethiopia developed a very different set of program, but it's very important for those at the bottom. So you're sharing information, but at the same time, you're also trying to listen to the client and say, well, what are their real concerns, whether it be an infrastructure development, whether it be some agriculture, whether it be, a port or trade. And remember, part of my more general point is, if you help people solve problems, you show you can actually do more than talk. This goes to the relevance of the bank. People talk about, I used to get these questions, and in some ways, who knows, maybe it was because at the time I was there was a great demand. Man, I had no problem having people want us to do stuff. I mean, I had a lot of people knocking at my door. But part of it was this combination of respect, engagement, having people that from their countries there. And kind of the other one that was always amusing to me was that if you go to China, which has not exactly done so bad in development, the bank has an extraordinary brand. The bank, from starting with Deng Xiaoping and Robert McNamara, was kind of, the bank is seen as an extraordinary partner. So when some countries say, can we work on you? I said, well, go talk to the Chinese, see if they found it useful. But the nature of your services have to change too. So just to give you a thought, since China's a topic in the news, one of the last things I was able to do at the bank was to launch a process with the individuals who are now the incoming leaders, particularly Premier Li Keqiang, with the Chinese to do a joint project looking at the structural reforms that China needed, the China 2030 report. And it's also interesting as a bank, the fact that we looked at this so-called middle income trap issue is of great interest to many other sort of emerging market countries. So it again shows part of the challenge as a policymaker is, can you leverage something? Can you expand it? Can you get, and then of course, it's not just what you do, it's kind of how you create the interest and opportunities for others. So it all comes back to serving the client, but serving the client is not a passive act.
One quick clarification. By client, do you mean the government or the public?
Interesting question. Very good question. We are, I wasn't there at Bretton Woods in '44. I couldn't design all this, but in essence, the countries are the shareholders, okay? And so the governments are the shareholders. But because I studied transnational relations under the eminent Professor Cohen, one of the things I learned was that even within something called country X, there's going to be different groups. So skill, you might, the trade ministry might have a different view than the environmental ministry, than the others. And so we need to try to work across them, but be sensitive to whoever the prime player is. But in addition to that, I forget whether it's a question here or others, but what I've been trying to do with broadening of the society, to support the civil society, the transparency and openness, is where the borderline gets a little tricky, because what we're really saying is, yes, the government is our shareholder, but can we convince the governments that working with the broader society and the input is actually in their interest? And it isn't too, nefarious or complicated in any way, because what really happens is the governments that don't want to do it, you won't do it. And other governments that do want to see it, and some in North Africa these days are very excited about taking our lessons about governance and development and others, because that's what they started a revolution for. Others, they won't. And so I'm a big believer, if you also look at the development history, say of East Asia, people look at models. They look at real things that get done, okay? And so, you know, look at the history of East Asia, you know, Japan, Hong Kong, Korea's development, Taiwan, then the effect that it had on others in Southeast Asia, including Burma or Myanmar. Government leaders, I've spent a lot of time with them in over 30 years, you know, they look to what other countries do. You know, they may or may not have the textbook knowledge in something like that. And so if you can sort of share with them ways to the importance of engaging the society, even an authoritarian system will understand the benefits of rule of law. Even authoritarian, take China, interesting example. One of the people who will probably become in the next 5 years in the standing committee who didn't make it this time, a fellow named Li Yangchao, was the party secretary in Nanjing, in Jiangsu province, when I met him. He then went on to head the central organization department, does all the personnel movements. He organized, in effect, 360-degree reviews and polling for the attitudes of reaction. So it's a far cry from democracy, but they are not insensitive to what public thinks in the delivery of product. And so if so far as you can show this will lead to better performance, a lot of people will find that to be a value you bring to it.
My name is Marina Henke and I'm a postdoc here at the Woodrow Wilson School. You are involved in one of the most fascinating negotiations of the last 20 years, the German Unification.
Sounds like you're from Germany.
I'm from Germany.
Go, where?
Stuttgart.
Ah.
Would you mind sharing with us some of your lessons learned? What do you think are the key skills negotiators need to be successful in these negotiations?
I will do better than that. How about this? Is that if you, you can, we'll put Professor Cohen to use. I actually sent up an article, but I brought one just in case, that I wrote in National Interest in 2000, which was 10 lessons from German Unification. So I'll give you that article, okay? But in essence, this is a wonderful sort of case study in different ways. Okay? Start of it was some of the things that I alluded to about anticipating, trying to get ahead of the issue. So one of the stories that I've shared is that early in 2000, or no, in 1989, then Defense Minister Stoltenberg, who had been Finance Minister Stoltenberg, comes to the State Department. He sees Baker. Baker didn't normally see defense ministers, but he was a friend as finance minister. There were some German officers standing around before the meeting. And so one of the things that I think you learn in diplomacy is ask questions. So I was asking some of them, what do you think about what we then called reunification, and as you know, became unification for legal reasons? And I started to get some interesting responses about kind of attitudes. And then one of the senior State Department officials came around and said, you know, what are you talking about? We said, reunification. And she said, well, you know, the subject that all Americans are interested in, no German cares about. That's an interesting lesson. This is a person who had 30 years experience in the Foreign Service. And what do you think that German colonel said after that? Okay? So the first point was anticipate, sort of listen, sort of and learn. A second point was building the relationships. So this comes from a longer story, but with the Gorbachev, with Shevardnadze, with Genscher, with Kohl, with some of the events of the end of the Cold War. There was a very important NATO meeting in early '89 that with some trying to negotiate through short-range nuclear missiles, but also conventional forces, you develop trust. And I can't emphasize this enough. It's true with the discussions going on right now with the President and the Congress, where unfortunately there's a little bit of deficit of that. But when you're dealing with such complicated issues, you partly have to listen and try to help the other person sort of address and solve the problem. In the US case, frankly, this is something that I have a particular pride for my country. What I think was really good was when the moment of destiny came for Germany. Germany had done an awful lot to lodge itself in Europe and the transatlantic relationship. And as you undoubtedly know, most Europeans cut and ran. And so the fact that the United States actually said, this is what we've stood for 40 years, this is what we believe in, we're going to support you, I think was actually a nice thing about the United States, and I think actually was reflected in the types of partnership that we built. Now, there were others. Jacques Delors was very much of the same view. So people kind of seeing history stage. Another aspect, though, is that one I mentioned in a different context here. This I apply to coal, but I apply to policymaking more generally. Bismarck had this phrase about the sign of a statesman is somebody who recognizes fate as she rushes past and grabs onto the hem of her cloak. Okay? And I've always liked that. And in Cole's case, he was so big, he grabbed on and he could really move. But the reason I've liked it is it says you have to be watching. You have to be alert. Fate will move back quickly. You have to grab it. But then how you try to act and operate on it. Then there were aspects that I referred to here about the public, how to take the momentum of the German public mood. And there are lots of interesting little examples of this, but just to give you one, when the 2+4 process was created in Ottawa in early 1990, one of the reasons I thought it was very important was, and this goes a little bit to the perception of history, I was concerned that East Germans who had lived under a Nazi regime and then under a Soviet regime, while there was a vote coming up in March, that they wouldn't believe it was for real. Now, you or I might believe it's for real, we're used to that system. They live in a very different system. So the announcement of the 2+4 was partly a public diplomacy because it sent a message in the East, hey, this is for real. The four powers may ever do this. The 2+4 was also the one issue that was actually disagreed among the NSC and state teams. And for an understandable reason, everybody wanted to use the momentum. The NSC team was afraid that by creating this process, this would allow the Soviets to slow it down or block it. My view, and the view of Secretary Baker, was that actually the Soviets had four-power rights, they had 380,000 troops, they had lots of ways they could muck it up. We actually needed to create a process to then channel that momentum and sort of move it forward in the process. So, and then, this was another interesting point, even while dealing with the issue of the day, and this is something, you know, look, sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't, but we tried to be thinking about how this issue would fit into the future stream of events. So Baker gives a speech in December of '89 in Berlin where he's talking about how you need to see German unification in the context of the unification of Europe, changes in the US-EU relationship, the then CSCE, NATO, this institutional structure. And as you can see, I'm somewhat of an institutionalist on these things. But so we're partly then talking about how these changes need to be done in a way that don't just deal with the immediate problem, but reassure Germany's neighbors and create a structure for the future. And I'll give you one more little modest sort of example of how this becomes extremely real. The last night before the final settlement agreement was signed in Moscow in September or October of 1990, we still had an issue that held us up. And the issue was, what would be the rights of non-German NATO forces in the Eastern Länder? Okay? And because we weren't going to sort of formally position or have non-German NATO forces in that area while the Soviets were withdrawing. This is a wonderful little example of the seas of something. And so people were debating, will you allow bans, will you allow so on and so forth, and it almost held up the agreement. And we worked out something in the end that had a note that said, Germany will, as a sovereign state, by the way, the core concept of returning Germany's sovereignty, will determine this with the context of these overall issues. But one of the things that, the reason why this was on my mind, that by this time, as you would probably guess, I was in pretty good friendship with the Germans, so they didn't attack me for this. But I was tough on this issue, as were the Brits, for this reason. I was thinking, you know what? Someday Poland may want to come into NATO. And I don't want to foreclose the ability of non-German NATO forces to cross Germany into Poland. Now, I couldn't exactly say that in the meeting with the Soviet representatives, but it's an example of, even as you're doing today's issue, you need to try to be kind of thinking about the one to follow. And the absolute last point I'll mention, because this is the nicest point of all, was that our job as American officials was much easier because the American public and the American Congress were all behind this. So obviously, I got hate mail from Britain about, you know, people, sad stories. People lost their husband, their children, so on and so forth, or their husband and father, you know, in World War I or World War II. I think it was a wonderful thing that basically the American public said, freedom, democracy, of course these Germans want to be together. And so we're going to try to support this. And that made our job a lot easier. So when it comes time to Korea, make sure you help.
Okay, last question.
But I'll remember the article too, okay? So I won't forget. Will you help me remember?
Right here.
Okay.
My name's Kate Orkin and I'm a visiting PhD student at the Woodrow Wilson School. I did all of my fieldwork in Ethiopia, and I was interested to ask from that perspective, from the perspective of other countries in Africa like Rwanda, where they're delivering excellent results, but they're moving away from being called democracies and moving more to what's being called a competitive autocracy in the political science literature. And so I wanted to say, what do you think the bank's position on promotion of democracy ought to be, and what do you think it currently is?
Well, what I think it currently is that the bank cannot formally be supporting any one political system. You've got 188 different countries. That's the issue about kind of as supposedly a non-political institution. But I do think the bank can support aspects of governance, participation, openness. I gave the Chinese example. And a lot of it's how you design that into the system, and whether you can then convince the country that these are in their interest. Okay? Now, let's go specifically. With Ethiopia, I focus on a slightly even preliminary issue, which is that the late Prime Minister Meles, who was truly a brilliant man, I mean, an autodidact, I mean, and he engaged in discussions, you know, it was quite an amazing feat with him. But I worried that and there was a lot of poverty reduction, a lot of things accomplished there, but his desire for state control was ultimately going to stymie the growth. Because when we visit the private sector and others, their control of credit and foreign exchange, led by the way, some very left-wing people or liberal, open-minded, Joe Stiglitz, you know, these sort of things, was actually quite restrictive on the private sector in this society. So the role of the bank was to kind of caution, press, warn, make other cases, show you be supportive, you know, but at the same time, you know, they were a major recipient of some of our aid for the poorest because they were overcoming poverty and increasing growth. And so your hope is over time that with economic growth, there's no assurance that you will move to more open political systems. Now, again, this one little point, because maybe making my optimism view. I was in Hong Kong on a fellowship in 1980, and I had Chinese students in Hong Kong. And when I used to talk about democracy, the answer I got, remember, this is Deng Xiaoping coming, everything, very excited about the rise of China. I said, hey, democracy exists in Japan in some perverted form. It's a Western thing. They can't work here, okay? You know, fast forward, geez, 30 years. And all of a sudden, you know, democracy in Taiwan, democracy in South Korea, democracy in Indonesia, Philippines with its own struggling, others. And so I just don't buy into this thing that these societies don't want to transform. Where I'm different than some people is I think you need to create it through an enabling environment. And so I said what the formal was, and Rwanda. This is an interesting one, though, and I've spent a lot of time with Rwanda. Did you work in Rwanda? Okay. There's a wonderful book about this. It's called 1,000 Hills, and it's a kind of the story of Kagame, but also the other aspect. The one thing, and maybe this is sort of a humility in the process, I think it's important. When a country's gone through genocide, and the country, and you know, in some ways Rwanda is a lot like Israel today. Because Rwanda had a bunch of UN resolutions and a lot of nice language, and their people got slaughtered. And nobody helped them. They talked, but they didn't help. So if you're Kagame and you're the people in that system, you listen to the nice resolutions and stuff like that, but you have to take care of the basic security. Now, I will also tell you that when I worked with Darfur, the best troops in terms of peacekeeping and the most disciplined troops were the Rwandans. These guys were serious, okay? And serious officers that I talked to, when they couldn't believe it, that Sudanese would, in a sense, foreclose through violence the ability to get people to hospitals, and they tried to play a mediating role in this process. So I mention this, but having said this, Kagame's a friend, and I'm the sort of person that will say to a Kagame, look, you know, it will hurt you internationally, and also for the long term, it's not the legacy you want to create. Just as, say, with President Uribe in Colombia, I argued, you know, do not do what other presidents have done in Latin America. You've had 2 terms, step down. You know, that's the best. Giving up power is in some ways the most important legacy you give for your country. Kagame will face that choice too at his term. And I have no hesitation in making, but this is personal, sort of that argument to him, whether I was in that job or not. But I guess what I'm saying is, this is in my mind because Goma's in the news and things like that. And so I haven't read the UN report, so I have to be careful, I don't know. But I've developed a certain skepticism about sometimes these reports. And here's what I do know. That's a Wild West place out there, okay? Nobody's keeping security, okay? And there were a lot of people that crossed the border that slaughtered a lot of people in his country. And so how they're going to keep security, you know, in other words, I don't know. He says he's not influencing this group and others. But so all I'm saying is sometimes Westerners or developed countries just, I'm not saying give up the values or the questions, but just keep an open mind and try to hear their side of it.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us.